Welcome to another episode of the Esoteric Lounge podcast. I'm your host, Dan Crisafulli. In this episode, we're going to go into the history of Freemasonry. If you're not familiar with what Freemasonry is, it's a fraternal order that has its roots in many different ancient civilizations. It draws from many religions and ancient mystery schools. Freemasons are not stonemasons, although some may be coincidentally. They practice speculative masonry, using the tools from operative masons of the past and applying them symbolically to their lives. These tools are then used to make a man better, well-versed, and self-aware. Through masonry, a man seeks to put the best side of himself forward in the world. There is, however, a more esoteric side of masonry, which is of interest to many modern-day masons. Freemasonry is described as a peculiar system of morality, veiled in allegory, and illustrated by symbols. Adopting tenets from ancient Egyptians, Knights Templar, and many other esoteric traditions, Freemasons are tied deeply to these studies. The rituals, themes, secrets, and much more have been preserved for hundreds of years. I'm a Mason myself, and I take great pride in the craft, experiencing a newfound fervor for the world, as well as new ways to change myself and others for the better. My studies in subjects such as the Kabbalah have improved tenfold. It has greatly complemented my interests as a whole, and I'm elated that I get to practice this craft until I die. I hope that if you're listening and you are a Mason, you enjoy this story. And if you aren't, perhaps you'll get something out of it that piques your interest in Masonry. Either way, this is a poignant look at the history of Masonry as it pertains to the founding of the United States of America and several events and prominent figures in European cultures as well. I'll be reading a chapter from the book titled The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth. I first read this book around 2011, and it was the book that I would say kicked off an obsession into studying topics like this podcast covers. It's a great book, and I encourage you to add it to your library as well. Without further ado, The Age of Freemasonry from Mark Booth's book, The Secret History of the World. If alchemy was the core practice connecting the Rosicrucians and early Freemasons, the outward forms of these societies were quite different. There were only 8 Rosicrucian brothers in the original brotherhood, and their House of the Holy Spirit was supposed by many to exist on another plane. Later generations were still elusive enough to suggest that there were only a few of them. By contrast, Freemasonry spread around the world, quickly recruiting thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Today, even if it doesn't advertise its existence, there is a substantial Freemasonic lodge in most large towns. Outsiders know where it is, even if they don't know what goes on inside. Following the Rosicrucians' catastrophic attempt to direct political action, ending in the Battle of White Mountain, Freemasons would now operate behind the scenes. Rather than seeking to impose reforms from above, they reverted to the original aims of the secret societies, influencing them from below. In the case of Freemasonry, the aim was partly to help foster the social conditions which would bring people to a stage in their development when they would be ready for initiation. Freemasons worked to create a tolerant and prosperous society with a degree of social and economic freedom that would give people the chance to explore better both the outer and inner cosmos. The evolution of free will would bring about many of the great changes foreseen in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, his vision of the perfect Rosicrucian state. Prompted by Francis Bacon, people had begun to see the inner cosmos and outer cosmos as distinct. There arose out of this an understanding of the material world and the way it worked, which would not otherwise have been possible. And in a few short decades, this understanding had thrown a metallic embrace around the world, as railways and machines of mass manufacture transformed the landscape. The great thing about science was that it worked. It produced testable, reliable results and tangible, life-changing benefits. The contrast with religion could not have been more pointed. The church was no longer a reliable source of spiritual experience. The Scottish philosopher David Hume asked, sarcastically, why is it that miracles always happen only in remote times and places? The result of all this was that physical objects became the yardstick of what is real. The inner world began to seem like just a shadowy reflection or shadow of the outer one. In philosophy's central debate, the one between idealism and materialism, idealism had been dominant since philosophy's beginnings. As we have suggested, this was perhaps not because the majority of people had weighed up on the arguments on both sides and come down in favor of idealism, but because they had experienced the world with an idealistic form of consciousness. Now a decisive shift took place in favor of materialism. We may see Dr. Johnson, author of the first English dictionary, as a transitional figure. He was a church-going Christian who countenanced the existence of ghosts, and on one occasion heard his mother crying out to him over a distance of more than 100 miles. Yet he was one of the apostles of the common sense view of life that is the ruling philosophy today. Once walking down a London street, he was challenged to refute the idealism of a philosopher, Bishop Berkeley. He kicked a stone by the other side of the road and said, "I refute it thus." This new way of looking at things was very bad for religion. If nature obeyed certain universal laws that ran along certain straight, predictable tracks, then it was indifferent to the fate of human beings. Life, as Thomas Hobbes put it, is a war of all against all. The wasteland of Central Europe following the 30 Years' War became the spiritual wasteland of the Western world. It's possible, if you are so minded, to see the decline of religion with sardonic glee, but for most people, the gradual withdrawal of the spirit worlds has been experienced with an increasing sense of alienation. Without the living presence of beings from the higher hierarchies of gods and angels to help them, people were left alone to confront, as we say, their own demons. Humanity was entering a new dark age. Neo-Solomonic temples sprang up all over the world. The esoteric aim of Freemasonry would be precisely this: to help lead humanity through the age of materialism while keeping the flame of true spirituality alive. Of course, Freemasonry is often thought of as atheistic, particularly by its enemies in the church. But a Freemason has sworn an oath to, quote, study the hidden secrets of nature and science in order to better know his maker. From the start, Freemasons had wanted to discard unthinking religion, false piety, and the accretions of centuries of church practice and dogma, particularly the crude idea of a vindictive father figure. But the higher orders have always sought direct personal experience of the spirit worlds. As philosophers, they have always been interested in attempting to define what we can reasonably say about life's spiritual dimension. As we are about to see, many famous Freemasons of the 18th century, who are usually thought of as skeptical, if not downright atheistic, were practicing alchemists, and some even participated in ceremonial magic. Moreover, some great Freemasons from this period were reincarnations of great personages from the distant past. They were returning to fight in the greatest battle with the forces of evil since the first war in heaven. If Scottish and English Freemasons supported a constitutional monarchy working with a democratic parliament, the situation was very different for the American colonies. George Washington was initiated in 1752. On 16th of December 1773, a group of men, apparently native Indians, played a large part in inspiring the American Revolution. After they had dumped British tea into Boston Harbor, they hurried back inside St. Andrew's Masonic Lodge. In 1774, Benjamin Franklin met Thomas Paine in a lodge in London and urged him to emigrate to America. Fond of quoting the words of Isaiah, Paine became the great prophet of revolution, proposing a federation of states and coining the phrase, the United States of America. He argued for the abolition of slavery and state funding for the education of the poor. In 1775, members of the Colonial Congress were staying as guests in a house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Their aim was to design the American flag. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were present, and so was an old professor who seemed to be staying there by coincidence. Somewhat to the surprise of the others, Washington and Franklin deferred to the professor. They seemed to recognize him as their superior, immediately and unreservedly, and all of his suggestions for the design of the flag were promptly adopted. Then he vanished and was never seen or heard of again. Was this stranger one of the hidden masters who direct the history of the world? In their individual shape and in the pattern of their arrangement, the five-pointed stars on the flag echo the symbols on the ceiling of the chamber in the Egyptian pyramid of Unas. In Egypt, they were a symbol of the spiritual powers raining down their sustaining and guiding influence on human history. If we insist, against all the evidence, on seeing Freemasonry as an atheistic organization, spiritual only in an empty modern sense, we will fail to understand how its leaders felt themselves prompted by mysterious powers, some incarnated like the old professor, others the disembodied spirits of the stars. The architecture of Freemasonry grows out of an occult magical tradition of invoking disembodied spirits that goes back to ancient Egypt. When the materials are all prepared and ready, it is said, the architect shall appear. On the doors of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., there is a depiction of a Masonic ceremony that took place in 1793, when George Washington laid its cornerstone. If we contemplate Washington's designs for the Capitol that would bear his name, with this building at its heart, we can begin to understand Freemasonry's secret plans for the age. The key to this understanding, perhaps shockingly for those who would like to see Washington as a model of Christian piety, is astrology. Freemasonry's interest in astrology had good, strong roots in the Royal Society. When Newton was challenged on the subject, he said, "Sir, I have studied the subject. You have not." Elias Ashmole had cast a horoscope for the founding of the Royal Exchange in London, soon to become the center of world finance, as well as for St. Paul's Cathedral. When George Washington had a horoscope cast for the founding of the Capitol building, he was acting in accordance with a solemn Freemasonic tradition, which charted the history of humankind according to the movements of the stars and planets. For esoteric Freemasons like Wren and Washington, the act of consecrating a cornerstone at an astrologically propitious time meant inviting the hierarchies of heavenly beings to participate in the ceremony. It is significant that at the very moment George Washington laid the foundation stone of the Capitol building, Jupiter was rising in the east. The phrase annuit captis, which hovers above the pyramid on the dollar bill, is adapted from a line in Virgil's Aeneid, "Jupiter, favor us in our undertaking." The phrase novus ordo seclorum, also to be found on the dollar bill and which worries conspiracy theorists so much, is also adopted from Virgil. In the Eclogues, he looks forward to a new age when the people will be reunited with the gods, so there will be no need for religion. The dollar bill therefore looks forward to the end of the Catholic Church's world domination and the beginning of a new spiritual era. Replete with esoteric symbolism, it was designed under the aegis of President Roosevelt, a 33rd degree Freemason, who was advised on occult symbolism by his vice president, Henry Wallace, a fellow Freemason and disciple of the theosophist and artist Nicholas Roerich. After years of researching and having been granted access to the Masonic archives, my old friend David Ovason wrote a magisterial book, revealing in all but completely plain terms the esoteric plans that have motivated America's leaders. He shows that a great triangle of streets with Pennsylvania Avenue as the hypotenuse was intended by Washington and L'Enfant to mirror the constellation of Virgo. He shows further that in a spectacular light display to rival the greatest achievements of the Egyptians, Washington, D.C. is laid out so that on the 10th of August every year, the sun streams down Pennsylvania Avenue and strikes the Pyramidion on the top of the post office tower. It requires a whole book, David's book, to give a full account. What is important to this history and helps us to begin to pull its main themes together is that Washington, D.C. was laid out to welcome Isis, the goddess associated with Virgo. Washington then built this city under the sign of Virgo, inviting the mother goddess to participate in the destiny of the United States. Another old friend, Robert Lomas, has pointed out more specifically Masonic orientation. At the beginning of an 8-year Venus cycle, the bright morning star can be seen from the White House, rising above the dome of the Capitol. Then on the evening of that day in February, on or around the 6th, the president will be able to see the zodiac, the holy royal arch of Freemasonry, exactly as it appeared at the consecration of Solomon's Temple. We've seen that secret techniques for achieving altered states are taught inside secret societies. Different grades of initiation lead to different levels of altered state. Higher levels may grant the gift of prophecy. Great initiates have such an all-embracing knowledge of the higher spirits and their plans for humanity that they are able to work consciously towards helping the fulfillment of those plans. Initiates from different esoteric traditions and different parts of the world had been predicting the dawn of a new age. Yakin, Dee, and Paracelsus prophesied the return of Elijah, working behind the scenes of history to help humankind become strong enough for the trials that it would have to face. By inviting the Mother Goddess to participate in the destiny of the United States, Washington was also looking forward to a new dispensation. The United States would dominate the world if Washington's great prayers in stone were answered and the ancient prophecies came true. Abbot Trithemius, influenced by Joachim, and influencing in his turn both Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, had predicted that the epoch of Gabriel, the archangel of the moon, would be succeeded by the epoch of Michael, archangel of the sun. He predicted that this great event would take place in 1881. We saw in Chapter 3 how St. Michael fought the good fight against the forces of evil, leading the hosts of the good angels. The Freemasons of the 18th and 19th centuries foresaw that St. Michael, archangel of the sun, would come again. Michael was coming to fight the forces of corrupted angels and demons that were predicted to assault the earth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Michael's defeat of these forces, with human help, was to lead to the end of the Kali Yuga, the dark age of the Hindus, which had begun in 3102 BC with the murder of Krishna. The yugas are astronomically determined, there being 8 divisions of the great year. In fact, the initiate astrologers of the Freemasons realized that Trithemius had a small mistake in the astrological calculations, and that Michaelic age was due to begin in 1878. All around the world, as this year approached, Freemasons were planning to erect monuments. Above all, they planned to erect obelisks. The Egyptians saw the obelisk as a sacred structure on which the phoenix alights to mark the end of one civilization and the beginning of another. An obelisk is a symbol of the birth of a new age. Like a gigantic lightning conductor, it draws down the spiritual influence of the sun. Constantine the Great had converted a temple in Alexandria into a church, reconsecrating the obelisks sacred to Thoth that stood outside it to the Archangel Michael. In 1877, Freemasons on both sides of the Atlantic worked to transport these 2 obelisks by sea, one to London, where it was to be raised on the Victoria Embankment overlooking the Thames and popularly known as Cleopatra's Needle. It was to be raised on 13th of September, 1878, when the sun was at its zenith. Its twin obelisk was raised in New York's Central Park, organized by a group of Freemasons led by members of the Vanderbilt family. Michael was, as we have seen, the leader of the heavenly hosts, and the transition from one order to another is always marked by wars. And because what happens on earth is always an echo of what has happened earlier in the spirit worlds, a great war would be fought in the heavens before being fought down here on the earthly plane. As Freemasons erected an obelisk in Central Park, New York, they were invoking St. Michael and all his angels, asking for their help as they sought to establish the leadership of the United States among the nations in the war-torn age that would soon be dawning. It may already have occurred to some readers that obelisks are placed with similar prominence in ecclesiastical contexts. For example, the obelisk erected by initiates in the square in front of the St. Peter's in Rome. The upper echelons of the church hierarchy wish to keep its flock from conscious knowledge of the astral roots of their religion. But these monuments work on different levels. They attract the disembodied beings of spiritual hierarchies. They work on people at levels below the conscious one, levels where the great disembodied beings weave in and out of our mental space. Initiates inside and outside the church create great works of art and architecture to help condition humanity for its future evolution. They also carry enough clues for those who are so minded to decode them. This concludes the chapter The Age of Freemasonry in Mark Booth's book, The Secret History of the World. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.